Hello students, how are you all? 7th standard students, in science we are learning the lesson reproduction and modifications in plants. Shall we recall what we have learned? Yes, reproduction in plants. What is reproduction? Plants and animals produce their young ones and increase their number. This process is called reproduction. What are the two types of reproduction? Sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. In sexual reproduction, plants reproduced with seeds. In asexual reproduction, plants reproduce without seeds. Then sexual reproduction takes place in two ways. What are they? Pollination and fertilization. Already we have learned pollination. About the pollination, many things we learned. What is pollination? What are the types of pollination? Then what are the agents helps for pollination? We learned many things. So what is pollination? Pollination is the process by which pollen grains transferred to the stigma. So pollination is the process by which pollen grains from the anther transferred to the stigma. Then in flowers there are four important parts are there. Petal and sepal are the accessory organs and stamen and pistils are the reproductive organs. Stamen is the male reproductive part of the flower. Then pistil is the female reproductive part of the flower. So these two parts are the important reproductive parts of the flowers. Then we learnt pollination. What is pollination? Transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma. This pollination carried out by the agents. The agents like insects, animals, wind and water. These are the agents for pollination. Then pollination is of two types. Self-pollination and cross-pollination. What is self-pollination? Self-pollination, pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same flower or another flower of the same plant. So self-pollination takes place in same plant. But cross-pollination, pollen grains are transferred from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower of the different plants. So in two different plants, pollen grains are transferred. That is cross-pollination. So two types of pollination are self-pollination and cross-pollination. In this video, we are going to learn about the life cycle of flowering plants. So already we have seen two ways are in the reproduction. One is pollination, second one is fertilization. So in the flowering plants, the flowers have the important reproductive parts, stamen and pistil. Then pollination takes place in the flowers. Then after pollination, the pollen grains transferred to the stigma of the flower. Then flowers transformed into fruits. Then these fruits produced seeds. Then matured seeds germinated. Then germinated seeds grow into a new plant. By this way, the life cycle of flowering plants takes place. Now let us learn fertilization in plants. How fertilization takes place in flowers. Through pollination, what will happen? As through pollination, pollen grains are reach stigma. Look at this picture. In this yellow parts are there. Pistil is there. This pistil is known as stigma. It contains stigma. The pollen grains from the anther transferred to the stigma. Then what happens next? The chemical substances present in the stigma causes the pollen grain to germinate. So in this germination, the tube develops from the pollen grains. Look at this picture. An yellow color tube arises from the stigma, yellow color tube. So through this pollen tube, the male gamete transferred. So male gamete from the pollen grains transfer to the ovary. So male gamete reaches the female gamete inside the ovary. Inside the ovary there is a one sac is there, one bag like. In this bag female gametes are present. Inside the ovary egg cell are there. These egg cell fuses with the male gamete from the pollen grains. So what is fertilization? Male gamete fuses with the female gamete to form zygote. This process is known as fertilization. So what is fertilization? The process in which male gamete from the anther fuses with the female gamete. Where is female gamete? In the ovary to form zygote. So the fusion of male gamete with the female gamete forms zygote. This process is known as fertilization. Students, what will happen after the fertilization? After the fertilization, flower is changes into fruit. So this ovary only transformed into a fruit. So ovary develops into a fruit. Look at this picture. In this flower, there are two ovules are there. These two ovules are transformed into the seeds in a fruit. So the ovary is develops into a whole fruit. Then ovules in the ovary develops into seeds. What vegetable is this? Brinjal. Above the fruit of the brinjal, there is a green part is there. What is that? Yes, that is sepal. So, in brinjals, the sepals of a flower will not fall from fruit and remains with the fruit. After fertilization, in some flowers, sepals are fall off. But vegetables like brinjal and lady's finger, these sepals are remains with the fruit. Then custard apple. This custard apple made up of many fruits. This fruit is known as aggregated fruits because in this fruit many fruits are aggregated. So each fruit part is very thin. Then they have seeds. So which is edible. In mango, the outer skin and middle part, bulby part are edible and very sweet. Do you all like mangoes? Yes. So innermost part is with a single seed. So these mango contain outer skin and middle pulpy and inner hard shell, that is seed. In peep seeds, fruit is not fleshy but forms a covering pouch for many seeds. Inside the pouches, many seeds are there. So, in of these above the examples, ovary, a lowermost swollen part of the pistil, develops into a fleshy fruit. So ovary develops into a fruit, then ovules develops into a seed. So with these observations, shall we list the changes taken place in the flower after fertilization? So what are the changes occurs after the fertilization? These changes are known as post-fertilization changes. So what are the changes occurs after fertilization? Calyx sometimes remain with the fruit. Then petals and androsium fall off. Then style and stigma fall off. So after fertilization, calyx remain with the fruit. That means sepal remains with the fruit. Then petals and androsium fall off. Then style and stigma fall off. Then ovary develops into a fruit and ovules develops into seeds. So these are the post-fertilization changes. Next, asexual reproduction in plants. Two types of reproduction, sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. Already we have learned sexual reproduction. Now asexual reproduction. What is asexual reproduction? Yes, the production of new plants without the involvement of pollination and fertilization is known as asexual reproduction. In sexual reproduction, involvement of pollination and fertilization is there, but there is no involvement of pollination and fertilization is known as asexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction have four types: vegetative propagation, budding, fragmentation, spore formation. What are the types of asexual reproduction? Vegetative propagation, budding, fragmentation, spore formation. Let us see one by one. First, vegetative propagation. Vegetative parts of the plants. What are the vegetative parts of the plants? Leaf, root, stem. These are the vegetative parts. So when these vegetative parts grows into a new plant, this type of reproduction is called vegetative propagation. In potato, shoot arises from ice. So vegetative parts of the plants such as root, stem and leaves can help to propagate the plant. So in bryophyllum is the plant in which the leaves are gives new plant. Then roots in sweet potato, the root gives new plants. Then stem, ginger is the underground stem, so the stem develops into a new plant. The next asexual reproduction is budding. Do you know yeast? Where it is used? Yes, in the bakeries, yeast are used. Then for making cakes and breads. These are very soft in nature. So these cakes and breads gets softness by the action of yeast. So single yeast undergoes asymmetric division. It produces a small protuberance which gradually grows and detaches from the parent cells. A small bud-like structure formed in the yeast. These buds then afterwards removed from the parent, then grows into a new young one. This process is called budding. So budding takes place in yeast. They forms the bud-like structure, then this buds develops into a new young one. Next sexual reproduction method is fragmentation. Have you seen in the pond the green colored algae are floating on the top of the water? They are algae. Spirogyra is one of the algae. When it matures, the filaments divides into pieces. So after maturation, the body of the algae, that is Spirogyra, fragmented into small pieces. Each piece develop into a new young ones. So in Spirogyra, they produce fragments. These fragments develops into a new young ones. This process is called fragmentation. The next method of asexual reproduction is spore formation. Spores. Spores are the seeds-like structures in the plants, mainly fungus. This fungus, where we can see fungus? Yes, in the spoiled food items, we can see the growth of fungus. One of the fungus is rhizopus. In this rhizopus, they formed the spores, seeds like spores. So what are the conditions necessary for the growing plants? Yes, good supply of water, then temperature, proper temperature level, then nutrients. So on these favorable conditions, these spores are developed into a young ones. So unfavorable conditions like scarcity of water, high temperature, nutrient deficiency in soil, etc. are the unfavorable conditions. So during these conditions, Non-flowering plants like algae, fungi and ferns produces spores. Then when they attaining the favorable conditions, they germinate into a new plants. So during the unfavorable conditions, they forms the spores. Then after the favorable conditions, they germinate into a new plants. This is the spore formation in rhizopus. So dear children, I hope you all understood about the fertilization in plants. So we learned pollination and fertilization, then sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. The next class we can see the modifications in plants. Thank you children.